Hello and good afternoon. Thank you for coming to today's program. My name is Erin Payton, and I'm the Executive Director of the 19th Century Charitable Association, which is located in Oak Park, Illinois. Our mission is strengthening our community through learning, giving, and the sharing of our landmark building. We have another great program for you today, and hopefully you are nice and warm and comfortable and can enjoy it on this snowy day if you're in the Midwest, or actually pretty much anywhere in the country. Before we introduce today's presenter, I just want to let you know that something she says might spark a comment or a question. And if that happens, you can leave that comment or question in our chat feature or in the Q&A. And if there's time at the end of the program, we will let you ask the question yourself. So now I'm going to bring to the program Diane Moses. Diane is our program chair, and she is going to provide an amazing introduction to Dr. Rebecca Thompson.
Hi, good afternoon. Rebecca Thompson leads the Education and Public Outreach Office at the U.S. Department of Energy's Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. She comes to the lab with 2 decades of experience leading physics-related outreach to communities, students, and teachers. Her outreach efforts at APS, the American Physical Society, included partnerships with NASA and Laserfest and authoring a physics-related comic book series. She is very proud of being named an APS Fellow and a member of Sigma Psi. In the summer, she spends weekends working as a pyrotechnician for a local fireworks company, and she is also an avid triathlete. Let's give her a very warm virtual welcome. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I am really excited to be a part of this and to be able to present. So one of the things that I do in my public engagement is talk a lot about the importance of storytelling. It's important to not just tell your audience physics facts, science facts, but to really engage them in some way. And storytelling is a really important component of that. Before I talk about that, I do want to mention the importance of representation in STEM stories. So when I was growing up in high school, I watched the X-Files like a lot. Huge fan of the X-Files. It was, a great show, cutting edge at the time. But more importantly, and what, really led to kind of long-lasting impact of the show was the character of Dana Scully. It was the first time in my entire life I'd seen a female scientist, a female agent that didn't kind of fit in that very standard strong woman type of, you can't, you're not a real person, you're just kind of a female, strong woman, which didn't really describe me. And wasn't really the way that I wanted to view myself. I was really kind of this whole person. And the thing that made Scully so wonderful is that she was that. She wasn't a trope. She was a full character with a backstory, relationships with both her family and, Mulder eventually and aliens. But she really was a whole person. She was a full character. And that's why she ended up having a lasting impact. I went on after watching the X-Files to get my degree in physics, and then from there on to get my PhD. I am also one of the very few who was lucky enough to be able to tell my hero about this at Comic-Con in 2013. I was there for my comic book and for showing off, my comic to comic book fans. I waited in line, slept on the pavement to get into the X-Files anniversary panel. Through a couple of elbows, got to stand in line and tell Dana Scully, Gillian Anderson, that she inspired me to continue on to get my PhD in physics, much like her character had gotten an undergrad degree in physics. So that's me. That's one person. But what she said is there's something called the Scully effect, where it's actually there's been documented increase in the number of women getting STEM degrees during kind of the heyday of the X-Files. So me being a data person, I went back and looked at the percentage of women that got physics degrees. And what you can see, and this is not scientific data at all. This is just me and Excel and some numbers. There is a real shift. There was a peak in the percentage of female bachelor degrees in physics, or degrees awarded to women in physics, 4 years after the X-Files peaked in viewership. It's kind of cool, but this isn't real data. However, on hearing Gillian Anderson's comments at Comic-Con that year, the Gina Davis Institute for Representations of Gender on Film was like, I wonder if we could study the Scully effect. So they did. And what they found was that 63% of women in STEM say that Scully was a role model. That means it's not just me. 63% of the people that have my degree saw Scully as a role model. That's incredible. 63% of women said that Scully gave them the confidence to succeed in a male-dominated field. Again, that's huge. And then they continued that research and showed X-Files to girls that were, now in high school, looking at their career choices, looking at what they wanted to do. And 50% said their interest in STEM increased after watching the X-Files. Representation matters. There's documented data that says representation matters. So first and foremost, when I'm talking about the importance of storytelling, this is the foundation for how I tell stories, how my characters work, and what I want to talk about. The importance of representation is incredible. Following that up, I am also someone that was lucky enough to see my childhood princesses grow up to be generals, which is pretty amazing. So once you have the characters and know how important representation is, you have to think about really what it means to tell a story. So here are two of my favorite quotes from people that really are science storytellers. We've got Alan Alda, who in all of his science communication training really stresses how if you're not telling a narrative, no one's going to hear it. You need that hook of a story. And then there's Story Collider, which tells science stories. And its entire premise is based on how important storytelling is in communicating science. So when you talk about science storytelling, there's really two sides here. There's two ways that you can do it. One is teaching with narrative. So you have stories that already exist. You have stories that someone else has written, and you use those as a hook to explain science. So here are two books. I think there's even a third generation of Hollyweird Science, Physics of Superheroes. So Jim Kakalios, who's actually in Minnesota, taught an entire first-year physics course on using superheroes. Attendance was incredible, and he wrote a book on it. Then the opposite of, on kind of the other side of that, not opposite, but another way to look at narrative in science communication is the idea of writing narratives that teach. So this is a bit of a different way of looking at it. What this is saying, you know what? I want to teach a science concept. There's an idea I want to get across. So what I'm going to do is use a story to get that idea across. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. You've got down, down in the right corner is a series of comic books, graphic novels about a character, Max Axiom. And they are used to tell all sorts of science stories. My one beef with them talking about representation is they don't have any women superheroes, which is not good. They say they don't sell, but that's a cop-out. Chris Pine's best-selling movie was Wonder Woman. Female superhero movies generally outsell male superhero movies. So this relying on sales is not good because it doesn't prove that point. So, in all of this, I do want to push the importance of female superheroes and the fact that you don't really lose anything with that. So Max Axiom doing it pretty well, except for the representation. Then you can have people like the New York Federal Reserve Bank tried to describe things using how they work using aliens, and it was awful, but hilariously awful. But these are kind of the two ways that you can use narrative in your science communication. I've been lucky enough to find ways to use both. So I'm going to talk about how I've used both in science communication, in teaching, and kind of the different ways that they work and the positives of each direction of this. So for a number of years, I wrote a science comic book about SPECTRA, the laser superhero. All of SPECTRA's powers were things that lasers can actually do. She could cut through metal, she could play CDs, which was relevant a number of years ago, less so now. She could, if she's going through a single slit, she can split into different, different versions of her. If she has higher energy after eating a snack, she's a different color. All of these great things that lasers do personified. And that hook of having a character that does laser stuff is going to help people remember that better than an entire, textbook on lasers. But when I wrote this, I knew the importance of narrative. So instead of saying, this is the list of things I want to teach, what I started with is, here are my characters. This is what I want to do. These are the characters that I'm using, and this is what they are. And so for every character in this, I wrote what's called a character sheet. And this was 1 or 2 pages about everything about them. And it didn't have to be anything I'd ever use. It didn't matter. I needed to keep in my mind that these were real characters. This is their favorite color, what sports they play, what they do in their free time, what they might, when their birthday is, all of those things. I used none of it. Or I didn't use none of it, but I didn't use a ton of it. How they would react to different situations. And as I was writing the stories, I could always fall back on this character sheet if I put my characters in a situation and didn't know where they were going to go. One of the best ways this really came into play was in SPECTRA's energetic escape. What happened with that is I told the narrative very differently. And so I started with the end of, there's a merry-go-round on the roof of the school. And every character told part of the story. And if I didn't have really strong characters with really strong, character sheets, I would never be able to make those voices different. I would have struggled with that. But because I started with the character sheet, I could tell a narrative that apart from the science was a strong narrative. I wrote SPECTRA for middle schoolers. It's been a minute since I've been a middle schooler. And, I'm not the market research that Disney does. So I needed to kind of do some research. I approached things like researchers do. And I spent a long time trying to figure out what kids are watching these days. I am a proud subscriber to Disney Plus. I remember from my youth loving Kim Possible and Doug. Now we've got Andy Mack and WandaVision. And I sat down with these. I watched so much of this. It's actually pretty great. And I looked at what plots were repeated. Every episode or every series, maybe not WandaVision, but all the kind of middle tween TV, they have episodes about, having a fight with your friends and how do you make up? Having a fight with your parents, how do you make up? Getting, in trouble and how do you deal with that? They all have, with a different hook, these same basic ideas. So as I was writing SPECTRA, I really focused on those same themes that middle schoolers seemed to want to hear about. Additionally, it's the first time a lot of these kids have heard bad jokes. So you can go all out in bad jokes, like the stuff that we are used to hearing and is cliche by this point. They've never heard it before. It's great. So my middle school humor went over wonderfully. So from there, once I realized what these students wanted to hear, I needed to move on to trying to use my medium, the graphic novel format, to my best advantage. So writing a book is one thing, and I've done that as well. And that's one way, but to create a graphic novel that people want to read, you really need to find a way to tell this story both with art and with words. And so I worked with a fabulous artist, Dave Ellis. And what we figured out how to do is use the art to get across physics concepts. So when I was writing SPECTRA's Quantum Leap, she was battling the quantum mechanic, and not really battling, they just, the quantum mechanic couldn't really control her powers. There's a lot of puns in there if you know a bit about quantum mechanics. But one of the things that the quantum mechanic had to do was tell the same story to 3 different characters in 3 different places at once, which is a cool way to talk about superposition and talk about how one particle can be in 3 places. But it's really repetitive from a narrative point of view. You don't want to draw 3 pages of her telling the same story to 3 people. So what my artist was able to do is do it in 3 panels, connecting the speech bubbles and telling the same story to 3 people, but only telling it to the audience once. I never could have done this in just written work. So SPECTRA ultimately worked because it had a strong foundation in narrative. I'm by far not the only one that spent time writing science comics. The difference is I came at it from a narrative point of view and not with a list of bullet points I wanted to teach students. And that's why these were really transformative in how kids viewed a number of science concepts. This is why, you know, we've reached millions of kids through the SPECTRA comics, and it's been great. So this is my story about really creating a narrative that teaches, but I'm not the only one. And one of our favorite characters that I in spite of your feelings on Wonder Woman 1984, she's been fairly popular. This was also begun like Wonder Woman began as a comic to teach. And so William Moulton Marston, who also invented the lie detector. And one of the things that he did was use this comic to push his ideas. So he created this character. She was a symbol for the suffragette movement, which he pushed through that. A lot of the imagery was very similar to the suffragette imagery. And he also put things in there to get across the importance of lie detecting. He wanted people to believe his lie detector could work. And so he created Wonder Woman. This was initially a comic to teach that was much better disguised than my SPECTRA comics. And it has lasted. First one, she showed up in Sensation Comics 1941. She's, you know, for a long time was her own comic and, you know, had her own comic for a while because it was really part of the suffragette movement. Or because it was born out of the suffragette movement. Marston really made sure to keep her this independent, strong, fully developed superhero in her own right. And then she's, you know, even got her own stamp collection. And then when Marston died and that image, that copyright passed on, she was immediately relegated to the secretary of the Justice League. So I'm fascinated about how this comic that was used to teach then became, you know, particularly around the suffragette movement and lie detectors, then became, you know, almost the opposite of that. She's obviously since grown from there. That being said, I can also use Wonder Woman in the opposite direction and use the narrative in this fabulous story to teach. So I absolutely love the first movie. I love the second, but I know that there's more controversy over that. And this is one of my favorite scenes. So this is Wonder Woman kicking butt in an alley.
Oh, it's the bad guy convention.
Give us Dr. Maro's notebook.
Where'd I put that thing?
Step back.
Or maybe not.
Tough luck.
Is there anything else you want to show me?
So, that's great. And probably everyone looks at this scene and thinks, wow, her arms are strong and her, you know, her wrist cuffs are strong. I wanted to know how strong. This is a physics problem I can solve. So if you look at a bullet, you can figure out the momentum. And when a bullet hits something, it transfers, particularly if it then stops, it transfers all of its momentum to the thing you're hitting. So bullet going really fast, hits something, and all of that momentum is transferred to that. And then that thing that it's transferred to is going to move a little bit. So I can look at what the momentum of a bullet is, and momentum is mass times velocity. Bullet, really high velocity, itty bitty mass. So what does that mean when it hits something steel, like Wonder Woman's gauntlets? So moves forward, and it moves, her gauntlet moves back just a tiny, tiny bit. So a bullet hitting her wrist cuff is really only going to make it move about 0.5 miles per hour, which is not that much. Steel stopping a bullet is not as impressive as it seems. However, Wonder Woman is still a superhero. but not because of strength. The question is, can she get her arm where it needs to be in time? So reaction time is distance divided by speed. Can you move in the right direction fast enough? So we've got, I assumed that the bullet was going to be about 10 meters away. Assuming you can see the flash from the gun, your brain knows instantly that the bullet, that the bullet's on its way. Average bullet speed's about 900 meters per second. So assuming that for Wonder Woman to get her arm in the right spot, she has 1 millisecond. The average human reaction time is 250 times slower than that. So Wonder Woman, super strong, and you can see that in other ways, but it's really the speed that saves Steve Trevor this time. I think that's interesting because it's not what people assume, but it's still going to be, it's still superhero-y and it's still pretty accurate. Speed of sound. So she has to, speed of sound, if you could only hear the bullet and not see the flash, there's no way she can do it. So that to me is interesting. Another way I really like to look at this whole, speed, these classical mechanics problems. One of my all-time favorite movies is Frozen. I love this movie. It's great. Frozen 2 is possibly one of the most feminist Disney movies I've ever seen. Highly recommend it. Could give a whole TED talk on the feminism in Frozen 2. And why I'm here, what do you need is the best line a Disney prince ever said. That being said, it can also teach us about how reindeers jump.
Jump, Sven!
So watching this, we're all very excited that they all made it across the chasm. But my question was, being me, could they have? Is that something that could happen? So it's easy to look at this as a physics problem. So you've got Sven the reindeer sitting on one side. And as he jumps, he's got two things going on. He's jumping at an angle, I'm going to assume 45 because why not? And some of that velocity is up and some is over. Really all that matters is that the over velocity is enough to get him there while he's falling. So as he jumps, gravity is pulling him down. And he's going to go in a parabolic curve, which means he's going to jump. And we all have seen baseballs do this. But what we need is for this path to end up here and not here. So with air resistance, that's going to be a little bit harder. It's going to actually push it a little bit this way. The cool thing about reindeer, particularly the tiny flying reindeer, and I don't know what breed Sven is that they actually have skin flaps. And they can jump pretty far because as they're going and they're falling, there's air resistance up too. So it takes them a long time to fall out of the sky. With all of that physics coming together, reindeer can jump about 10 times their body length. And Disney was nice enough to give me a way to measure that. And so if I look, this is Sven, this is one Sven here. And that chasm is only about 6 Svens. So it turns out that he could have made that. And from a narrative perspective and the importance of really using real science that we're all comfortable with in this kind of story, we feel good about that. If Sven had made a really huge jump, we wouldn't have felt so good. Already we're on the border of feeling good about this, but we intuitively know the laws of physics. And when a show breaks the laws of physics, it will jerk us out of that. And so I really like using these kind of examples to show how we as humans understand physics enough that if this type of idea, if Sven had to jump a little bit more, we'd really not be okay with it. Already we feel kind of iffy on it, but he could have done it. But we wouldn't feel good if we didn't have an intuitive sense that he could have made it. So I'm going to talk, one of the things I got to do was write a book on the science of Game of Thrones. It was wonderful. It was an incredible experience. It's not just physics, it's all over. And Game of Thrones as a story did both the best and the worst job of sticking to science. And I'll talk about how it did both. So on one hand, it really did an amazing job with some physics. So one thing I will say is that this is a little bit more mature than Frozen. So if you have kids, maybe it's not, there's no nudity or cursing, just some stabbing. So, up to you. But on one hand, Game of Thrones stuck to enough physics that we felt good about it. We felt like this maybe could happen in a fantasy world, and that was cool. So one of the first examples of this is Sam. For those of you that maybe haven't seen the show, one of the characters, Sam, is in a position where he needs to fight this zombie ice lord thing called a White Walker. No one knows how to kill White Walkers, so this is all just a guess. And I'll talk about why one way worked and why one way didn't. Here we go. That's the White Walker coming through the trees.
Stay back! You stay back!
So there, if it wasn't easy to see or you haven't seen the show, he tried a normal steel sword and that didn't work. That shattered in the cold. And then he tried what's called dragon glass, which is a variant on obsidian. It's kind of magic obsidian. And so my question is, would steel really shatter if it was in extreme cold? And it turns out that yes, it would. So steel is a really neat molecule. It's a combination of iron and carbon, and it's the way it's produced. There's a long history of the production of steel and the difference of cast iron and wrought iron and how to make weapons grade steel. Steel is amazing. And we think of it as very, very strong. The thing is that steel it's strong because of how the atoms line up. And I could go on and on about how neat steel is. But one of the big problems with steel is that it undergoes what's called a ductile to brittle transition. So at some temperatures, you can mess around with it. It's malleable. You can hammer it into things. And then very, very, very suddenly, based on what percentage of carbon you have in the steel, and it can be all over, it will all of a sudden break. This was, this is interesting when it comes to White Walkers, but it had more of a direct application in the Titanic. There wasn't a lot, at that time, there wasn't a lot of quality control in carbon percentage, and you can see that ductile to brittle transition takes place at very different temperatures based on the carbon content. And there's some evidence that if the Titanic had hit a coral reef instead of an iceberg, it would have just dented the hull and not shattered it. So this ductile to brittle transition has some real life applications, but also extreme applications in Game of Thrones. So Game of Thrones, to kind of overcome this, and there's a lot of fantasy in our fantasy, to overcome this, they created this idea of Valyrian steel. Valyrian steel has a number of properties, but let me show you probably its most important to the narrative here. So Jon Snow, the human, the sword that he picks up at the end is Valyrian steel. That's normal steel. I'm gonna fast forward. Jon Snow's my least favorite character. We don't need a ton of time with him. He's not bright. Here we go. So this is, Jon is within reach of his Valyrian steel sword. And Valyrian steel can stop a White Walker and kill them like dragon glass. So this is extremely important to the narrative because one of the things with Valyrian steel is it's quite hard to find. However, it's based on something called Damascus steel. So Damascus steel is fascinating in that it has a really high carbon content. You would assume that it would break easily. It has these very precise heating and cooling temperatures, and all of this magic, essentially what seemed like magic at the time, but there's, you know, a lot of work on how to create it, was done to get steel that pretty much resembled the properties that Valyrian steel is supposed to have. So Damascus steel, it has this beautiful patterns and is, you know, has an edge that's so sharp it can cut a hair the hard way. No one quite knew how it was made for a long time. Couldn't be reproduced. A number of groups tried to do it in the 80s with no luck. And finally, in the early 2000s, a group came along and was like, you know what, I'm gonna cut that up and image it, and let's see what we got. So back in the 3rd century, they were creating these magic swords, but the magic was actually carbon nanotubes. So to give you an idea about how strong carbon nanotubes are, it would take 377 elephants to permanently bend one. They are extremely strong. And people were accidentally creating swords with these carbon nanotubes on the edge. So Game of Thrones has a just wealth of physics, and I can talk about, you know, elliptical orbits and why we have seasons, and there's just so much that they get so right. And that's one of the reasons that for some seasons we were so captivated by it. It felt kind of okay. We felt like we understood it. It played within a set of rules. It played within enough of our real life rules. And I loved that part of it. One of the big problems, though, kind of the flip side about narrative, is when it's using correct physics, we are all in. We intuitively understand when rules are being followed and why we love stories that have a consistent set of rules. And then Game of Thrones took a hard left. And one scene, one episode in particular, was about when, and I don't have any good clips of it because no one wants to see that again. They were stuck on a rock. Someone sent Gendry back to the wall, who broke the marathon record. Ravens flew, dragons came back. The timeline didn't feel good. This pivotal episode of this entire season, it's the first standoff, you know, some sad stuff happens. It's this pivotal emotional moment in the narrative. And the next day on the forums, everybody was talking about Gendry's speed, the flight speed of a dragon, and how none of this worked, and where did they find chains. So because the narrative, because the physics was broken, everybody was pulled out of the story. That's how important a consistent set of rules that you continually use, as well as some kind of touch points for your audience with real physics, is important. The irony of all of this is that the timeline for the Battle of the Wall is, or North of the Wall, is not terrible. If you do, you know, the calculations on how long it takes ice to freeze, how you can assume a raven flies, how, you know, fast Gendry could run. I mean, it's like a couple of days. But they didn't build that into the narrative, and we didn't feel good about it. So even in trying to keep to that science, they didn't give the audience a touch point to understand how this science worked, and so ended up pulling us all out. It destroyed the narrative. The lack of consistent rules, the lack of good feelings, completely broke the narrative. Also, people were asking, where did the chains come from? Irony. Buoyant dragon, it turns out you don't actually need chains. So they completely whiffed. And we can talk about the rest of the series, but to me, this combo and how Game of Thrones got it so right and so wrong, it exactly kind of the same way. It was jarring, and it's an interesting example of how important that that science, that touch point is to narrative, or to keeping your audience the narrative. The opposite of that, and one of my personal favorites, is Harry Potter. Harry Potter, for 7 books, 8 movies, did an amazing job of playing within its rules. It laid out rules in book 1, and it played within those rules. In, I think, book 7, Hermione laid them out a little bit more carefully. But we love, this story has become a national or international, franchise. Like I'm a Hufflepuff. I've been to Universal Studios. It's become that because it set out rules and it played within them and it didn't break them. I mean, and we could argue there's some plot holes, whatever. But we all knew where we were going, and we felt comfortable that when characters did things, it was things that we understood. We understood their thoughts, we understood their movements, we understood their choices, because they were all, contained in this world. And so the world building that J.K. Rowling did early on and set out for all the books is one of the reasons this has become such an incredible narrative. Because everybody every couple of years says Harry Potter's invisibility cloak could be real. I can't mention Harry Potter without talking about his invisibility cloak and how it could be real. Neat thing is they played within the rules with this invisibility cloak, which was also awesome. There's a couple of different ways if you wanted to create a real cloaking device that you might do it. This is by far my favorite. This is a group at University of Rochester, and they used, this entire device cost about $100. They used the properties of light and lenses to create points at which light couldn't actually, couldn't bounce off to your eye and couldn't be seen. And there's no way to do it, to really show it oh, is this not a video? Shoot. Oh, for some reason, this is not, unless was that a previous slide? Sorry. It would be great if I could get the video. I'm sorry, I thought I had a video and it's not playing. So I apologize for that. Pretty cool video. University of Rochester Invisibility Club. So all this being said, and the importance of narrative and the importance of having real science and how it keeps you in the story, one of my favorite examples of all time really combines all of those ideas. So I remember when this movie came out, I didn't cry at the end. I cried harder when a dragon died than I did at this, but that's okay. I left the theater not crying and confused about one thing. And I might just be too literal, but the ending, I got pulled out of the ending of this incredible movie because of one reason. There was room on the door. You have Rose up there, Jack hanging on. There's space. Why doesn't she just let him up? Is she a giant jerk? What's going on here? There is room on the door. And so this had bothered me for a long time. Then we had James Cameron come out and say, it's buoyancy, which sounded like a director kind of retconning the end to make us all feel better. Didn't really believe him, but he gave me something to go on. So all of a sudden I was like, you know what? I can answer that question. So let's do it. So is it buoyancy, or is it James Cameron just being a jerk and Rose taking up a whole lot of space? So buoyancy, if you have an item, an object in a liquid, and that object is less dense than the liquid, it's going to float, and that buoyant force is going to be dependent on how much of it the object is submerged, what the density of the fluid is, and that's going to determine how much it's being pushed up. So we have a sinking ship, and we have a door. So I looked at the Titanic to really see what options we might have had for what the wood of that door is made of. And I looked at the movie for a long time. It's definitely a door, not like a raft or something. It's a piece of wood. Most likely it was oak. It could have been one of three: pine, oak, or teak were really the three woods used in the making of the Titanic, but oak is most likely, so I picked that. With all of this, you've got the density of the door, you've got the volume submerged, and you've got gravity. And so the buoyant force pushing up is, and you can see here, I use newtons because it's a little bit more dramatic, 2,490 newtons. So the water is pushing up that much. So we need the door plus Rose plus Jack to push down no harder than that, and they can all stay on it and everybody lives. So the weight of the door is by far the heaviest. If you assume a certain door volume and density of door, it comes out to being about 1,920 newtons. So it's not a lot of room left for Jack and Rose. Well, let's assume that Rose, and I will say that it was terrifyingly easy to find her weight on the internet. I am not happy about that, but I did. And she comes in at about 549 newtons. It was also easy to find Leonardo DiCaprio's weight at the time. He came in at 712 newtons. The thing is, when you add them all up, it's just a little too heavy. So it turns out that there was in fact room on the raft, but buoyancy was not quite enough. And if you take Jack off, Rose lives a long and happy life. So even though that didn't seem like the right answer at the time, and it was a problem that plagued me for years, moral of the story is that you can't blame James Cameron for Jack's death, blame physics and the density of oak. So thank you guys very much for having me here today. I hope I was able to explain a little bit about the importance of science and storytelling, how to use narratives to teach physics, and how to write narratives that teach physics as well. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, I'm going to bring Diane Moses on now because I think she would like to kick it off with one question.
Yes. Hi.
Diane, for your video.
Yes,
There you go.
I am doing that. Hi. Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. I just have one question. You do many different things. What is your favorite activity?
Ooh, like ever? I think one of the things what I love doing when I feel just the best is triathlons. I know it's not science related, but I really love it. It feels so good to just be going out on a bike. In terms of science and in terms of what I like to do for work, I really enjoyed researching the Game of Thrones book. It's all about all different science. So not just the physics, I really branched out. I got to learn so much about how doctors think of things when looking at the medical aspects. I got to see so much about kind of the interactions that create science and the drama between different groups, particularly researching Valyrian steel. There were two groups that were going at each other, trying to be the first to create it. And it was like one published a paper, 2 years later, another did, and just back and forth. And they stopped when they died. I mean, this was their life's work. And then this group comes in 2005 and was like, you're all wrong. It's actually nanotubes. And the story of science that I learned while writing about it was really fascinating to me. So I enjoyed that quite a bit.
Okay, thank you again. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, Diane. I'm going to take you down. And that sounded actually very Wonder Woman. I'm going to take you down. That was so interesting, and I really appreciated you mentioning at one point with the when you were talking about some of the educational graphic novels, the representation, because I would say in general there is a lack of representation across the board and across all categories. Yep. in this, and I know it's changing, and I know it's getting better, and I know there are new voices coming out writing and stuff like that. Is there, from your way better knowledge than I have, is there anybody who's new and young and maybe doing something that you would recommend?
So there's a new series coming out through MIT Press. I'm not sure what's out. It might be Candlewick Press. They had a bit of a merger, called the Curie Society. And that's science-based female characters, which is great. A graphic novel that is not science related. Raina Telgemeier writes an amazing series of graphic novels for tweens and middle schoolers, and that's a lot about kind of social emotional learning.
Nice.
They're autobiographical, but she's an amazing writer and does a fabulous job of merging the art with the text, and getting across these really complicated ideas, and particularly these very emotional ideas, helping kids deal with dealing with trauma, dealing with siblings, dealing with anxiety. It's stuff that I really wish was there when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Disney, and I know that there's complicated feelings about like the giant that is Disney. They've used a lot of their platform to really create diverse characters. So if you look at a lot of their newer programming, it really is fairly progressive. I loved Andy Mack, which I because I watched it a lot for work technically, but they had a gay middle schooler, and that's the first time we've had a kid coming out. They had they had a bar mitzvah. Like nobody's seen that in the Disney I grew up in.
Yeah, I can speak from experience. I watch a lot of Disney Junior. There is definitely it's very heartening to see it. All right, I'm gonna stop talking because we have got some questions piling in. Okay. Okay. Here's a fun one. I'm gonna start you out real slow, okay?
Sure.
Here is Gil Herman. You want to ask your question?
I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Got a whole lot of questions on Star Wars, Star Trek, and the whole thing. But this is much more specific to physics, and it's something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. So how would you explain to, let's say, a middle schooler what string theory is all about?
I hate saying I don't know, but man, I don't know. That is an almost, I honestly don't know. This is not string theory specifically, but one of the programs I did with Fermilab, we had a week-long virtual open house, 5 days with a lot of programming. The last thing we did was Iron Scientist competition. So we had a scientist from NIU and a scientist from Fermilab given a mystery box of materials, and they had to explain the laws of attraction. And wow, did they do an amazing job. So we showed this last night, and we had a Q&A. And someone in the Q&A, and there were physical challenges thrown in. One of the contestants had to hop on one foot for a minute. And so one of the questions we got during the Q&A was for one of our competitors to explain quantum chromodynamics while hopping on one foot. And he did it. So while I am not really the one to explain string theory, if you are interested in learning a base level understanding of quantum chromodynamics, Brendan Casey, who was our iron scientist at the Fermilab education site in the last few minutes of that presentation, also available on Facebook Live, did an amazing job, way better than I could replicate here. And I am so sorry I don't have a better answer for you.
Can you give that website just so people can?
I will. I'm just going to put it in the chat real quick.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we are going to ask the next question, which I don't think is going to be as difficult.
Oh, thank God.
I warned you, I was starting out really, really difficult. All right. Marianne P. Okay, I'm going to say it. I'm going to ask for her. She says, physics was absolutely my worst subject in school. That's what Marianne said.
A long time ago, too.
Oh, hi.
There's a lot of physics that's come out since then. And I religiously watch Nova to try and understand and catch up on all that stuff I missed. But I was intrigued by the fact that you said that we intuitively know physics.
Mhm.
And I wondered if you could give a real life example of that, because it would make me feel so good if I could, if I could say that my physics is intuitive.
So it is, right? So let's say one of my cat's favorite games is knocking things off my desk. We play it all day long. And so my cat comes up, he looks at whatever's on my desk, he looks at me like a jerk and swipes his paw. I intuitively know where that whatever is going to fall, how fast it's going to fall, and what I need to do to catch it. I don't have to think about it. I know all of those things. I reach my hand out and I grab it. And everybody does that. Watching kids is interesting because they are figuring out gravity. I throw it here and it does this. I drop it here and it does that. If you play any sports at all, you have an intuitive understanding. So if you've ever played tennis, you know where that ball is going to go. You don't need to calculate anything. You jump and you do it. You know what you're doing. I'm a terrible tennis player, but most people,
Right.
many people, you know how to move in your world. And physics class, when taught by a good teacher, is giving you a language to describe in that language, in words and equations, what you already know. And one of the difficulties being someone that had an excellent physics teacher and has seen both good and bad physics teachers is the people that end up with students whose intuition is at odds with the problems they're doing. And I'm watching this, my niece is taking physics now, and it's awesome. I love helping her with physics. And one of the things I'm trying to get her to get okay with is that she has an intuition that something should be right. And then it's like, but that can't be it, and go somewhere else. And the best physics students are the ones that see it as a language to describe how they already move in the world. There's a couple of things that generally hang people up. But the number of students, like if I asked any of you to describe the motion of how you throw a ball in the air, you throw it up, it turns around and comes down, right? And we know this, and it is really difficult to get students to use math to describe it because they're overthinking it. And to me as a teacher, looking at using how people already move in the world to do that, every time you catch something, every time you know, I mean, now I'm learning it. I'm not from around here, so this snow thing is weird, but oddly, I lived in Austin for a number of years and I would have had to figure it out there. But anytime you drive in the snow and you know how to move because you know how your car is going to move on ice, that's physics. Anytime you are running in the sand or walking in the sand and you know how your body's going to have to compensate, that's physics. And what physicists do is put a language and put words to that. And we as humans get uncomfortable when either the language that we're trying to use doesn't fit what we know, or when we're watching a story where people are moving in ways that don't work for us. And so if you know how to move in the world, you know physics, you know all this physics, and really what a good teacher would do is teach you how to use a language to describe it.
Wow. You just made us all feel very smart. Thank you.
You are very smart.
You hear that? All right. Ruth Foley has she caught something in your intro she wants to ask about. Ruth?
Right. It was mentioned that you deal with pyrotechnics during the summer. So what do you do with fireworks?
So I work as a pyrotechnician, which is basically the grunt work of fireworks, and I love it. I get to be outside. And a fireworks display, putting together a fireworks display. So an 18-minute display takes about 12 hours to set up. And it's incredible. There's a lot of safety that you need to do. You spend the day setting up racks, depending on the size of the shell. And so if you have a shell in a tube, everything's going to be in a tube. And there's certain tube rating. and you have to put them in racks with certain, strength. As the firework lights, it pushes down with as much force as it goes up. And so you have to spend a lot of time solidifying the base. So if you're going to use 8-inch shells, you actually have to dig holes into the ground, build all these supports. So I do all that. And it's neat to learn about how these laws of physics apply to fireworks. Then at the end, it's all set up and it's an electronic firing system. So I get to rig all these wires, which is super cool. And then it's all rigged up with these wires in this electronic firing system. And then you push buttons and watch them all shoot off, and you're right there. And I remember one 4th of July, I was doing a barge show. So there's a giant barge, and we're in the towboat, and it's just like fireworks raining down on you. It was amazing. I've been hit in the head with shells, all safely with hard hats and all of that. But I think one of the most fun experiences was if a shell doesn't go off. So if you trigger it with the electronic trigger and it doesn't shoot, it's still dangerous. You actually have to either light it to shoot it off or put it in a bomb box. And it depends on the company what you do. This summer, we had one of our boards malfunction. And so we had an entire rack of unexploded fireworks, which is really freaking dangerous. So I got to light a flare and run along the line and light a bunch of unexploded fireworks and run like heck out of there and watch them explode. And that was awesome too. So there's a lot of physics in it, but I also like just being able to be really physical and out in the sun and getting to put all this together. So yeah, I'm not like fancy. I don't like make them or design them. I just put them in tubes and light them.
Yeah, but I think there's something to be said for someone who sets off fireworks appropriately and safely, and who isn't doing it at midnight.
Yes.
You have this down for me on July 16th.
Yes. And one thing I will say is, I play with really big fireworks. I'd never use homemade ones. You will not find me in my backyard lighting fireworks because they're not regulated as well. They're not safe. You don't have to follow safety precautions. I will not be lighting my own fireworks.
And there's such a big difference between like a little thing that goes and then it pops. And some of these things I can hear going off that I'm just so glad they aren't starting fires and anyway, enough of my soapbox. Marky has a fun question. Marky. Hi.
Now, initially I was going to say, I think you're phenomenal. I really do. I so enjoyed this, but my first question, because I have two, so you get to select. Okay. One was, can you ever go and just enjoy a movie? I wondered, and my second question was, is it generally only the fantasy types of movies that you look for the physics, the differences? What do I have?
So interestingly, and this makes more sense if you read my book, I did a whole introduction about how I don't want to ruin this for anybody. I don't want to be the one that sits there and nitpicks and is like, that can't happen and that can't happen. But I do like two things: figuring out why something made me uncomfortable and figuring out how I can use the good stuff to teach. So I'm not that killjoy. The only time that I am, there's two times. I have very strong feelings about the character Riley in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And if I'm ever on a rewatch, my husband just knows where to pause the remote, let me go on a Beck X talk, and then we go again. So I'm on a soapbox about that.
Yeah.
The other thing I often find myself in a soapbox about is crime dramas. And one of the things I had to spend a lot of time doing for this book, there's an entire chapter on all the ways you can die in Game of Thrones. And so that was a lot, but I learned a lot about death and the markers of different types of death. And so when I watch it on TV, they'll say things and I'll have to go off about how that's not right and here's why. And so it's weird. The physics stuff, I'm like, cool. I rarely have problems and I'm never the one to ruin. I'm never going to yuck someone else's yum. Like, I don't want to do that. And there's just a very few times that I kind of will go off about stuff.
Well, and I will say, as a child of a firefighter / paramedic, growing up in the 80s, watching things like TJ Hooker, my dad would just scream at the television, that wouldn't happen. So I think I mean, if you think about it, I'm sure that the people in the medical profession, police officers, scientists, there are so many people who watch shows and are just like, that's ridiculous. And it's all that whole willing suspension of disbelief and just sitting back and saying, this is never going to be exactly perfect. And I just have to, is the story intriguing? Is the acting good enough?
Yeah.
Are the costumes awesome? Can we just sit back and enjoy it? Because otherwise, yeah, you would never be able to watch anything.
No, and I like so many movies and so much TV. I do, another place I do get frustrated is when it would have been easy to include correct physics and they didn't. And it's kind of like, come on, guys, why'd you whiff on that? And,
Yeah,
and
lazy.
that's like, it was just, don't do it that way. It's super easy. So that, I do get a little iffy on that, but I enjoy a lot of entertainment and try to let others do so as well.
Well, we all thank you. All right, Dr. Rebecca Thompson, do you have any last words?
Just thank you guys so much for being here. I really, really enjoy getting to talk about this. I think the importance of narrative in so many aspects of life is often overlooked. And I enjoy having a chance to drill down on why we care so much and why narrative is so important to our life. And I really enjoy getting to share that with people. So thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, we thank you so much for being here. And again, for being here on such a cold and wintry day throughout so much of the country and possibly world. And if you sitting warmly in your own house want to see what else we have coming up, we have programs every Monday night and also other days of the week, including our gala, which is going to be virtual on March 13th. You can visit our website at www.19thcentury.org. If you want to help us continue to put on amazing programs like this, consider giving us a donation. Also available on our homepage, www.19thcentury.org. Well, for everyone at the 19th Century Charitable Association, we want to make sure that you keep your truths, so we don't have to bring out our lariat of truth, lasso of truth.
Lasso of truth.
Lasso of truth.
Yeah.
and find out more. So have a wonderful day. Stay safe, stay warm, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.